I'll share my thoughts at three levels. I thought one is the broader vision level, and then where we could zoom, supplementing what's already been said, and thirdly, illustrate a couple of actions that might help making a difference. And in terms of the vision, since we talked about bias, I thought let me use the acronym bias to say what's the vision we should have. The B standing for balanced, and I mean regionally balanced, because there are islands in India which are richer than richest of the countries. And there are large states of India which are poorer than sub-Saharan Africa. So if you're looking at a sustainable vision in 2025, it can't be without a regionally balanced India. The I standing for inclusion, the much talked about, be it from a social inclusion perspective or from the income inequality angle. So you also need that vision to encompass inclusion. And both of this will possibly happen only when A comes into picture, which is an accelerated economic growth. We are growing at 5, 6, 7, 8 in that range over the last few years, but I think probably that is not enough if we need to create a lot more regionally balanced and socially and economically inclusive, and therefore we need to hit and cross the double digit from an economic growth perspective. And lastly, yes, obviously standing for environmentally sustainable. The sustainability, what is applicable to world at large, is even more applicable to India, because we have 17% of all people, but just about 2% of land and 4% of water. A little more fortunate with 10% of biodiversity. So the entire ecological and environmental and natural resource sustainability is the S. So yes, we must have a bias in our vision, is at first level. Now within this, if you have to zoom a little bit more, and we started the session with the dusty Delhi, and I want you to take and think of the backyards of Bhopal. The metaphor really is about think rural as importantly as you look at urban, because urban is very close home for people who are vocal, and therefore as critical to look at rural. And that's the area I would like to zoom on. In terms of, in fact, as an imperative, much like Rajgopal had argued for the imperative of nutrition, very similarly the imperative of agriculture within rural, because still as many as 50% of all our workforce is relying on agriculture as the primary source of livelihood and producing barely 15% of our GDP. So if you look at the divide there, the per capita GDP from the agriculture sector is not even 1/4 of national average. And the national average itself is nothing much to write home about. So a lot of these issues, whether it is in terms of health, hunger, and education, a lot of these issues originate here in terms of that poverty is much closer home in rural. And that urban poverty which you see is also because a lot of migration which is coming from rural. So therefore that needs to be dealt with either from the angle of poverty and therefore all these other issues. And agriculture is also having many touch points with respect to environmental sustainability. It is probably the most significantly adversely impacted sector out of the climate change that Peter talked about. That the droughts are the floods. If it rains too much, too little, rains at the wrong time, the first sector which is going to get impacted is agriculture and the farmers' income, and so on. But what is less visible to each of us is that every kilo of sugar we consume has 2,000 liters of fresh water in it. Every kilo of wheat we consume has 3,000 liters of water in it. Every kilo of rice we consume has as much as 3,000 to 5,000 liters of water sitting in it. And therefore, both from the point of view of social as well as environmental perspective, there is a good reason as to why we must zoom in onto agriculture. So that's my second point. The third, in terms of what can we do about it. Some of this possibly is already well known and many solutions have been talked about. And before we look at what can be done about it, if you look at why this is happening, the underlying reasons are two. And first is that the policy that has been framed by government as was required in the mid-50s and 60s is something that we are carrying forward into the current, and as it appears, if nothing much is done, into future as well. There is no good reason as to why Maharashtra should be growing sugarcane, given the water statistic that I talked about, and not the eastern UP or Bihar. It happened only because at one point of time, sugar was promoted through cooperatives, through major irrigation projects, and therefore it took roots there. And now we are seeing the result of all of that. So a distorting policy, many times it was done obviously for a right reason at a point of time. Or that farmers should bring all produce to a market yard to put it up for auction, was valid in 50s and 60s and not valid anymore in the era of internet and multiple crops and so on. So I think the adjustment that is required in the policy regime in keeping with the times and needs hasn't happened with that kind of a pace. That shift is part of the action. Now the question there is, obviously there is a political economy associated with this. It's not just pure economics that we are talking about. So the solutions that we need to find to this need to be politically also right. Doesn't matter whichever party is in power. So if you say groundwater is my right as a farmer, I can pull out as much water without bothering about what is the cost of water because power is free and water is free. From that context, if you need to shift and say, I want to price water, price power, it's not an easy decision. And therefore, you need innovative solutions, whether in the form of penetration of solar pumps, in terms of how do you bring it in, or you look at water rights as coupons which can get traded in the market, so that you see value of it rather than trying to pull out unviable water from your own ground level. So I think the basic point is that in terms of how do you get a viability from a political economy perspective to shift most of these distorting policies. And same is the case of food subsidies, same is the case of fertilizer subsidy and so on. So market distorting policies need that kind of a shift to look at today's situation. The second is that a lot of science and a lot of technology has got good solutions for every aspect that we talked about in terms of farm productivity, the sensors that can deal with precision farming and crops that can work well whether you have drought or floods, all of this. But institutional innovation, which is in some sense a responsibility and an opportunity for the business to take all of this science and technology to the farmers. We have as many as 140 million farmers across the country. Now, taking it to these farmers in a manner that makes sense. Yeah, there are one-odd model which comes up every few decades. So we have the popular Amul, which made sense in certain sectors. And at the cost of some self-boasting, I must say that ITC's e-Chowpal brought that to some parts of the country. And different forms of collectives which are now shaping in the form of farmer producers organizations is another one which holds that kind of an opportunity, because we can't think of reaching these 150 million farmers otherwise. And possibly the next round will come out of the digital agriculture, which is really the next wave that is taking shape. And on our part, we are working on what is called the e-Chowpal 4.0 to take advantage of many new digital technologies to take this to the market. So I think dealing with the political economy of the policies and therefore ensuring that we are in right track, and on part of the business to look at institutional innovation to take science and technology to farmers would be the tracks, two rails on which we need to get to 2025 and achieve the bias that we want to achieve in this sector. Thank you.